Sir Richard Roberts will give, will give the lecture, but before that I will give the word and floor to the Director General.
I'm going to be very, very brief. As you know, this is our 30th anniversary board meeting, so we thought we had to do something really special to celebrate, and I can't think of anything better than a lecture from Rich Roberts to celebrate this occasion. Really very grateful that he's here. I really don't need to introduce him. He's an absolute tower of the scientific community, made incredible contributions throughout a very incredibly successful career, and of course, a founder of New England Biolabs. And I really do encourage you, those of you who are interested in local manufacturing capability, speak to Rich about how they started. It's a wonderful story. I'd just like to finish by saying that Rich has been on our CSA now for quite some years, and he's the best, okay? He doesn't just come for the 2 days. He works with us throughout the year, and that is so important. He's opened doors for us. He's helped us get funding. He works with governments. He knows many of your ministers and can work behind the scenes to try and solve issues related to assess contributions and so on and so forth. So, to my mind, he's the model for what a CSA member should be. So, Rich, thanks so much for coming.
You know, I always feel I should wear headphones during these things. It's so embarrassing. What I'm going to try to do today is to take anyone who might be slightly skeptical about GMOs and make sure that you come out of this talk loving them. GMOs are probably one of the best inventions that have been made in the last 30 or 40 years. And what's happened to them because of politics is just incredible. So one of the things that is absolutely clear is that we have two major problems underway at the moment. One is climate change. Climate change, if we don't do something about it, many of the large cities in this world are going to be underwater in 100 years. It's not long. 100 years isn't very long. The other thing is food. As you just heard, the population in Africa is growing at a tremendous rate. By the end of this century, they're going to be the most populous continent on this planet. These people need food. They don't have enough food at the moment. How are we going to feed the rest of them? And for the people who go to bed hungry every night, food is medicine. They don't need fancy surgery. They don't need even bandages half the time. They need food because this keeps them alive. And GMOs can help control greenhouse gas emissions. They can actually mitigate the CO2 that is in the atmosphere. You can suck the CO2 out. Plants do a very good job of this, but we can make them do much better than they do at the moment. You could imagine that every major crop could be engineered so that it sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's a lot of crops out there, many, many crops. We can do something really important there. You've also heard about other things, the microbes and so on, they can help. But the bottom line is agriculture is going to be incredibly important for us. Oh, sorry. Now, the one thing that I want to say right at the start is I hate the word GMO. I hate the term. But I have to use it because people understand it for the most part. But it's misleading. There is no form of life on this earth that has not been genetically modified. Every time we make a baby, we have a genetic modification coming out. It's unbelievable. Everything, it's called evolution. You know, we're biologists, many of us. We understand evolution. This is what happens. I was just in Madagascar. You go over there, it's separated from Africa, from India, 150 million years ago. You go over there, the life forms are quite different. You see things, you think, oh, I know what that looks like. You go, you look, and you discover, well, it looks a little bit about what I've seen before, but then all of a sudden you discover, oh no, this is different, because they've been genetically modified. Everything on this planet has been genetically modified, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally. But why we should be scared of it, I don't know. And one of the problems I have is the hypocrisy that abounds in the anti-GMO folks. You know, anti-GMO people can be diabetic. Where do you think they get the insulin from? Have you ever heard of a clinic where they take humans and suck out the insulin so they can give it? No, no, no. We genetically modify a yeast, a bacteria, a plant, and produce human insulin that way. We put the human gene into bacteria and into yeast. And this provides the insulin. It's medicine. That's why they don't object to it. They like that. They also were very, very concerned about COVID, right? The COVID vaccines were developed in rapid time, less than 12 months in order to produce them. And they're produced as a result of genetic modification. You know, the enzymes, 3 of the enzymes that were necessary for Moderna's vaccine, we made at New England Biolabs in the company where I work, right? We did that because we cloned the genes. We cloned the genes for 3 of the enzymes that were essential. Another case of a GMO. But perhaps the most difficult thing I have is that if you live in Europe, which a few of you in this room do, where do you think the animals get their food from? Well, they import GMO food. They import genetically modified soybeans grown in Brazil and elsewhere so that they can feed the animals. Now, remember, Greenpeace will tell you these are dangerous things. These GMOs are terrible. Why aren't the animal activists upset about this? Why isn't the general population upset about it? Right? You don't like GMOs and yet you feed them to the animals. Crazy, absolutely crazy, or simply hypocritical. Now, a number of years ago, I was at a celebration of Mark Van Montague's 80th birthday rather. And during that time, I spent a day listening to plant scientists in Europe saying why it was so difficult for them to do their work in Europe because of Greenpeace and the anti-GMO movement. And I was horrified when I heard some of these stories about people giving lectures and Greenpeace coming up and bombarding them, getting them out of, throwing them off the stage, stopping them, harassing them, trying to stop their funding. And I said, well, maybe I can do something about this. And I talked to 1 or 2 of my Nobel friends and I said, could we start a movement to really ask Greenpeace to behave properly? You know, when Greenpeace first started their anti-GMO campaign, they actually sounded reasonable. They said, well, we don't have a lot of experience. We don't know if these things are going to be dangerous. So let's get some science done. Let's find out whether these are dangerous or whether they're safe. Well, the bottom line is the science has been done and they're safe. Why don't Greenpeace just come out and say, hey, we're a great organization, you know? We asked the scientists to do the experiments and now they've done them and shown that these things are safe. Well, I'll tell you in a moment why they don't do that. But anyway, the bottom line is that over the course of time, we now have 168 Nobel laureates who have signed on to a letter that we sent to every UN ambassador down in New York. We sent it to the leaders of Greenpeace who refused to talk to me. They absolutely won't talk to me. And we said, just admit these things are safe. Don't keep scaring people about them. And I like this cartoon on the right, which was produced by a cartoonist over in Iowa. And on the left, you have the anti-GMO people saying, trying to tell everybody, oh, you know, this is really dangerous. Do you know what this is going to do to you? Well, I can tell you, for the poor children in Africa who don't get a decent meal every day, They know it can help keep them alive. We have a website, supportprecisionagriculture.org. You don't need to make notes of that. I will make sure that all of these slides that I use are available on the web. You can come to Support Precision Agriculture, but ICGEB will probably put it on their website too. All of the slides will be available to anyone who wants them. Now, as soon as you start to talk about food, if you live in a small village, you typically can grow your own. Smallholder farmers do very well. But if you live in a city, you don't have the land to grow your own. And so we need agriculture. We need farmers. We need the companies that set up the large agricultural groups that can grow the food that eventually makes it into the supermarkets. For about 10, 12,000 years, was a very crude genetics were being used in order to improve foods. People noted, oh, occasionally a hybrid was good and worked well. And then we learned how to do it a little better. But in the 1980s, just 40 years ago, we learned how to be precise. We learned how to make new plants with new properties in a much safer way than we had ever done before. Now, when you think about the plant breeding methods that are available, the traditional approach is you take a male plant, a female plant, cross them, and the progeny has picked up 50% of its genes from one parent, 50 from the other, just like when we make babies, exactly the same. Maybe it's a cross. It's got some genes from mom, some genes from dad. Is that a good thing? Is that likely to be safe? Just because you have the two parents and you put 50% of the genes together, does this guarantee that they're going to be safe? Well, according to Greenpeace, it does. And in the 1980s, when Mark Van Montague and Jeff Shell, together with Mary Dale Chilton separately in the US, came up with a new way of making breeding plants, of putting new genes into plants, and they took advantage when they discovered that this bacterium, Agrobacterium tumefaciens, is able to transfer DNA from within itself into the plant that it was growing on. And Mark and co said, hey, maybe instead of letting it use the natural genes, maybe we can put the gene we want to go into the plant this way. And in that way, they were able to get one or more genes into plants, but it didn't go in precisely. They didn't exactly know where it was going to go into the plant. But nevertheless, you could easily find things that had picked up what you want, that worked, that grew well. And that was the original GMO method. And it's still being used today, and it still works, and it's still quite good. But then later along came the CRISPR methods that Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier won the Nobel Prize for, because they figured out how to do it specifically. This is actually, CRISPR is a bacterial defense system. It's a way it defends itself against bacteriophages. But you can use the precision that comes by using CRISPR to make a specific break in DNA at a location you choose, so you know exactly where you're making the break, and then you can insert a new gene exactly into that position so that you know what you've done. It's very precise. And I like to actually illustrate this by thinking about something totally different. This is an analogy. So I've got a car, it's got a GPS system in it, and I decide I'd buy a new one, but it doesn't have a GPS system in it. Now, if I were a traditional plant breeder, I would take those two cars apart, mix all the components, and then pick the version that had picked up the GPS system. But instead of that, there's actually a slightly better way to do it. You can unplug the GPS system from one car and put it into a new one. Doesn't that seem sensible? That is the GMO approach. That's the GMO method. That is CRISPR in action. It's exactly what it does. You start to listen to the anti-GMO people, and they will tell you, oh, that's terrible. That's really awfully dangerous. Just imagine what would happen if you took a gene from a fish and put it into a plant. Okay? They might think if you took a GPS system from an airplane, your car would now fly. Do you think that's likely? Does that seem at all likely to you? No. And yet, I gave a talk one time in a library to some people. And I gave the talk. At the end of it, this lady came up to me and she said, well, you know, I hear everything you say. I believe it. I think it's, I just don't feel right about eating something, a plant that's got a fish gene in it. That's got to be dangerous. So I asked her, you know, when you eat fish for lunch or dinner, and you have some vegetables with it, what do you think happens when those two ingredients get into your stomach? You know, out comes the DNA, and now you've got fish genes and you've got plant genes rolling around. Is that safe? Well, she admitted that she'd never actually thought of it that way. But the important thing here is not how you do it. The important thing is what is the product, okay? It doesn't matter how you do things, it's the product that is important. You know, if you're a lady, you go into a store, you see a nice dress, and try it on, you look good in it, and then do you ask, oh, how was that made? No, if you look good in it, you buy it. It's that simple. And this is just as true for traditional breeding, where you've taken half the genes from one parent, half from the other, and now you have a huge mixture of genes. That, of course, Greenpeace says, oh, that's perfectly safe, no problems there. Unbelievable. Now, one thing that a lot of people are not completely aware of is that plants have a problem. When plants were evolving and something wanted to come along and eat them, they couldn't run away. They didn't have legs, they were stuck there. And so what did they do? How did they stop insects and other things from eating them? Well, they prevented it by making their own pesticides inside the plant, so that if something came and ate it, it would be killed. And its friends would see that this was not a plant that they should be eating. It's quite interesting. I like to use celery as a good example. You know, we pretty much all eat celery one way or another. There are a lot of pesticides inside the celery plant. Methoxysorolins, which can cause cancer if you eat too much of them. And in fact, it's rather interesting that in supermarkets, where very often you find the celery has been cut up into pieces, before people realized it, they just used to cut up the celery, they get the juice on their hands, and they suddenly discovered they were getting cancer because of the carcinogen that was acting as a pesticide inside the celery plant. When they discovered this, they started wearing gloves, of course, a sensible thing to do. But I think you have to look back and say, well, if these plants did not produce their own pesticides, if they didn't find a way of stopping insects and things from eating them, there wouldn't be any plants. They simply wouldn't be on the face of the earth. And so we eat them all the time. Now, I want to use this example that I mentioned very briefly from Dennis Ndolo. And he works in Cape Town. He's a very, very good scientist. And he faces two problems. One problem is called regulation. He has to work within the regulations in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa. And the other is there's a problem with pesticides, chemical pesticides. Typically, when you're growing plants, you put pesticides down when they're still very young to keep them safe. But then later on, those pesticides disappear, they don't work so well. And then when they get big, they put a second pesticide down, sometimes a third. And this last application of pesticide, if it's too close to when the plant is harvested and you're trying to sell it, the pesticide residues are still there. And consumers don't like this. And so you end up not being able to sell the plants that you've grown in the way you would like. And so what can you do about this? And what Dennis has been doing is to say, well, instead of using these chemical pesticides, we'll find biological pesticides that are not dangerous, that don't have these same effects on the people when you eat them. Now, when you think about this, this means that first of all, you've got to buy the pesticides. Then you've got to put them, you've got to find the right ones, put them in, spend all the labor of putting them on. But would it not make more sense just to put the pesticide in the plant, put the gene in the plant, and let the plant make its own? Doesn't that sound more reasonable to you? Right? Then you don't have to spray it, you don't have to worry, it can take care of itself. BT corn is a perfect example of this. You know, in the southern part of the US, growing corn is very important. And it was really quite difficult when the corn borer beetles used to come and start eating them. And then someone had the bright idea, well, why don't we put a toxin for these corn borer beetles so that they won't eat the corn? And in this way, someone came up and said, well, there's a very good thing that will do this. It's called Bacillus thuringiensis toxin. It's just a smallish molecule. The plant can make it itself, and then it kills the beetles that want to eat the plants. And now pretty much every corn that you eat in the US all is a genetically modified corn. You don't hear a lot about that, of course. Greenpeace, you know, they don't suggest you should stop eating anything made of corn because of this. And in fact, this same approach works in many places. In South Africa, BT corn was approved a long time ago. In Zimbabwe, it was not allowed. They say, oh, you can't do it. Mugabe had been gotten to by the anti-GMO activists and told these are so dangerous, you must not grow them in Zimbabwe. And the people in Zimbabwe started to starve. Fortunately, when Mugabe died, the government that took over talked to the people in South Africa and said, can we get some of this BT corn seed? Because this is going to do much better for us. And so now they're starting to grow it in Zimbabwe. Very sensible. Many examples where BT, Bacillus thuringiensis toxin, has been put into plants so they make it themselves. Now, an interesting fact, which you may or may not know, is if you like organic food, the organic farmers, right, they don't spray chemical pesticides or anything. What do they use? They use BT toxin. They use Bacillus thuringiensis. Sometimes they even just spray the plants with a bacterium. Other times they will make the toxin itself and then spray them. And this is perfectly okay. But if the plant makes it its own, oh, terrible, just awful. So I want to talk a little bit now about how this movement, the anti-GMO movement, came about. And it came about in Europe, and it came about because the Europeans got to be very suspicious that the Americans were trying to take over the food supply in Europe. In fact, they'd already pretty much taken it over because all the seeds that were being grown in Europe came from European manufacturers, from US manufacturers for the most part, occasionally some from Europe, but most from the US. And so when Monsanto made a horrendous mistake of introducing a GM seed into Europe, they did two things wrong. First of all, they charged the farmers more for it, and then that passed on, and then the consumers had to pay more, right? Instead of making it cheaper so that they would have come up and accepted it, and Greenpeace latched onto this. Greenpeace said, hey, you know, we can't ban Monsanto, right? If we could ban Monsanto, that would be, but they sell us all the seeds that we normally grow. And so they said, well, GMOs must be dangerous. And this is why the GMO movement got started. Okay, this is just a repeat of that. So what can we do about this? Greenpeace said, well, first thing that we'll do, we'll assert that GMO methods are dangerous and we need some science to find out. Well, that was partly right. You know, they didn't know. Might is the word here, but it soon became are dangerous. Not might be, are dangerous. The politicians and the Green parties are going to protect you from this risk. You know, the oldest political world game going is to say, hey, this is terribly dangerous. What this other candidate is trying to tell you about is really dangerous, but I will save you from it. Vote for me. And this worked for Greenpeace. They got a lot of political power, but best of all, it had no economic consequence for Europe by banning GMOs. And Greenpeace tripled their income every year because they were seen as protecting the Europeans from these very dangerous GMOs that were coming along. And of course, nothing talks more than money. You know, this is probably the most dangerous thing that humans ever invented was money. I'm sorry, if you look and ask why people do things, almost every time you discover it's for money. Now, on top of all of this, the Europeans came up with this precautionary principle, which I find almost as hypocritical as anything they do. They say if innovation is going to cause harm, then no proof it's safe. Let's wait until the scientific evidence is available. But how much evidence is enough? You know, do you need 6 months, a year, 20 years, 100 years, 5 generations? What do you need in order to do it? You'll never know. Insulin was adopted for diabetics very quickly because they needed it. Cheese, wine, bread, the processes that are used to make these involve genetically modified organisms. The vaccines for COVID, right? Did you hear anyone come out, any of these green anti-GMO people telling you, oh, these were going to be terribly dangerous because they used genetically modified ingredients? Well, no, because there was a medical emergency, and so it was okay. Now, I want to tell you the story of something that I find so disgusting, so appalling, that I think just on this story alone, one should be in favor of GMOs. You might be aware that children who rely on rice as their main staple often have problems because there's not enough vitamin A. Actually, you need beta carotene. You need to be able to consume beta carotene in carrots, in many orange-colored vegetables. But a lot of people who use rice as the main source don't have access to this. And they can't go down to the pharmacy and buy pills to contact it. And then in 1984, Peter Jennings had this great idea. He said, in rice, what if we could make rice produce beta carotene? Well, it turns out rice does produce beta carotene. It's in the stems, it's in the leaves, just doesn't make it into the grain. They tried very hard to make rice that would put it into the grain and couldn't do it. But then Ingo Petraikas at the ETH in Zurich and Peter Bayer at the University of Freiburg came up with this great way of persuading rice to make beta carotene. They started working on this, and it could have become a reality in 1999. This was when the first so-called golden rice was produced because it's got beta carotene in it. It's got a slightly yellow color as a result of that. Now, typically when something like that is produced in the lab, try it in field trials, and then within 2 to 5 years, you would normally have it available for distribution. But it's a GMO. And today, or I should say until a couple of weeks ago, it was only available in the Philippines. This was the only place where they were allowed to grow it commercially. And they had been growing it for about 1.5 years there. And now the Green parties got upset about this, filed a lawsuit in the Philippines, and have shut down not just the production of golden rice, but the production of everything that is a GMO. So BT crops, all of these, they've stopped. Now, you know, I don't think this lawsuit is going to stand up because the government in the Philippines really endorsed golden rice and endorsed BT crops in a major way. But now it's going to be stuck in the courts, and we're going to have lawyers arguing about whether or not this is really okay. But the bottom line is there have just been multiple years of delay because of the anti-GMO people. Greenpeace were especially upset about this. And they came up with an interesting document. The document, they called it Golden Illusion. And they said, well, it's taken so long, this was just produced a few years ago, it's taken so long for this to become commercially available that it can't possibly work. They neglected to tell you that the reason it took so long is because they stopped it. From day one, as soon as they found out about it, they stopped it. Incredible. And since 2005, when we actually have some pretty good statistics, literally millions of children, millions have died because they don't get enough vitamin A. And if golden rice had been available when it was first possible to have it out there, a large number of those would be alive today. And I want to know, how many kids have to die because you say this was a crime against humanity? I think Greenpeace and the anti-GMO should be up in front of the International Criminal Court. It's disgusting what they've done, killing people. Unfortunately, things are changing a little bit. They're not changing quite as much as one would like, and certainly not as fast as I would like. But I've got a number of things here, genetically modified crops that have been approved. One of the really big success stories was BT brinjal in Bangladesh. So that's eggplant. And they were having a problem. There were insects eating all the eggplants. And eggplants is really important in Bangladesh. The people there, the agriculturalists, came up by putting the BT gene into brinjal and started growing. And it was allowed because the Prime Minister stepped in and told the regulators, let it go, let people grow it. Now they grow so much brinjal in Bangladesh, they can't eat it all. They have to export it because it has been so successful. BT cotton is another example of a GM crop that's been incredibly successful in helping poor farmers in order to make a living by growing cotton successfully. I was very pleased to hear in India recently, GMO mustard has been approved. This sounded to me as though it was a pretty good thing. And you have to realize, I actually spoke to Modi on 2 occasions about GMOs. And this was at the time when his science advisor was anti-GMO, and nothing happened. Now the science advisor has changed. The current science advisor thinks GMOs are okay. And I have great hopes that India, and especially with some of the things you've been doing at the component in New Delhi, we will soon see that they will be adopting GMO plants. And perhaps this will send a good lesson to the rest of the world that these things are actually okay. Here's a bunch that are under development. In Uganda, I always like this. You know, in Uganda, 30% of the calories eaten by the population come from bananas or derivatives thereof, plantains. And they've had some major fungal diseases that affect bananas. Bananas, they've been so heavily modified that they're really quite susceptible to a lot of things. But this particular wilt that was caused, the scientists in Kenya actually came up with a banana, a genetically modified banana that was resistant to this fungus. They tried to get it approved in Uganda. It went through the parliament. Parliament says, terrific, yeah, we will do this. They sent it to the president to have the bill signed. President is all in favor of it. But then he has a wife and a daughter. And Greenpeace had gotten to this wife and this daughter and convinced them that GMO bananas were the most dangerous thing you could imagine, and persuaded the president not to sign the bill. And they're still waiting for it. Can you believe this? Unbelievable. But many other things, many good things going on. So I want to finish up by talking about a few different things that I think some actions need to be taken. So if you don't want to eat foods that have been derived by GM techniques, then don't. It's your choice. You can go into the supermarket, you can go into the local market, you can find loads of plants that are perfectly natural. You have choice. Unfortunately, though, a lot of people don't. But what I don't like is when people say, well, I'm not going to eat them because they're dangerous. Somehow they're going to cause me problems. It's not true. Absolutely untrue. Millions of tons of genetically modified crops are eaten around the world every year. Millions of tons. You don't hear much about that. And if anything, they're probably safer than traditional foods because we know exactly what the change was that made them more nutritious or grow bigger or whatever it is they've done. For developed countries, food isn't a problem. Right? When have you ever gone to a restaurant and said, oh, I'm sorry, you know, we only have one thing on the menu today. We don't have any choice. You have a choice, and it's easy. But we must never forget that when we start to make political statements or anti-science statements or something else within our country, either for money or for political power or whatever, word of this spreads. And we must never forget the consequences that our words can have for developing countries. It would be good if we had more science in politics and a lot less politics in science. And politicians really should listen to the science they fund. I want to know, why do they not listen to us after they give us funds to do experiments, to do research? It's unbelievable. Science shows that these things are safe, and yet the politicians think that they can only get re-elected if they are against them. Civil society can play a role too. I would like to see the major religious leaders speak out. I actually went and spoke with the Pope about this. He basically is pro-GMO, but he's been listening to an Argentinian economist who convinced him that these GMO plants were somehow destroying the smallholder farmers because they allowed the big companies to take over the smallholder farmland. It's not true. The statistics show clearly that it's not true. I tried to speak to this economist about it. He refused to speak to me. The best thing so far that has come out from the Catholic Church was this circular letter that went to bishops. You know, if you're a Catholic, they have this ceremony called the Eucharist, in which they drink wine and they eat bread, and this is supposedly the blood and body of Christ. The Vatican came up and said, if the Eucharistic matter is made of genetically modified organisms, it's valid, it works. I thought that was pretty good. Now, you know, I would have liked to see the Pope amplify on that a little bit, but I thought at least that was a good start. Now, we have some positive signs in Europe. So Finland's Green Party, the Green Party in Finland, now supports GMOs. England, after Brexit, has started to relax the regulations. And you can go on down, you can see that so there's a bunch of things going on now that make it look as though finally we're going to see some sense here. And I think CRISPR is going to play a big role here, because a number of countries now have treated CRISPR in a much more sensible way, recognizing that it is extremely precise. We've had some interesting converts. So this gentleman on the top left he was the guy who came up with the anti-GMO movement when he was head of Greenpeace, Patrick Moore. He came up with this whole scenario of scaring people about GMO foods. Greenpeace produced movies showing how bad they were. The gentleman on the far right, Mark Lyons, came up with the idea of Frankenfood, Frankenstein food. All of these were designed to scare people and raise money for Greenpeace. But the gentleman I like best is the one at the bottom from Ghana. He was the head of the Peasant Farmers Association. He was anti-GMO for a long, long time. But then he started talking to some scientists, and he listened to them and discovered that GMOs were perfectly safe. And he switched completely. And now he's a big proponent for GMOs. We need more people like him to speak out in the developing world. And I like this picture that someone sent me a long time ago. Have a heart. You look on the left, you see what a typical restaurant looks like in the West. You've got a choice. What do you want? You've got a menu this long, sometimes this thick, asking you for your choice. And then you go to Africa, you go out into the villages, and you discover there are peasants they just don't have enough food to eat. Many of them are going to die because they don't have enough food. And so to say that GMO is dangerous, that non-GMO is a good thing, may be okay for the developed world, but it does not work in the developing world. They don't know, they don't say, what am I going to eat today in Europe? They say, will I eat today? What? Anything, is there anything that I can eat? Please join us. We have this website, supportprecisionagriculture.org. We have a possibility for non-Nobel laureates to sign up and join us and come along with this. And I do want to briefly mention one person that I met last year. I was invited to Lebanon to speak at a ceremony at the Notre Dame University there. And the dean of the business school, Dr. Vivian Naimi, invited me, was my host. And we talked about GMOs, and then a little while, she contacted me and said, could we do something in Lebanon? Because she wants to find a way to reduce the poverty among the farmers in Lebanon. We thought that if we could get good GMO crops to the farmers, they could either make more nutritious crops that they can grow and sell for more money, or they can get higher yields. And so they will have a better income, because it tends to be the smallholder farmers, the small ones, who can't make enough. And I thought this sounded like a great idea. And we're now embarking on a mission to do this. And we hope to set an example that by introducing GMO plants into some of the smaller developing economies, that we can help wipe out poverty. We think this will be a great example if we can do the analysis properly. So I'm really grateful to her for that. I want to finish by talking briefly about something that I talk about after every lecture that I give these days. And this is very much in line with ICGEB's program to support women and help women in science and make them do better. I got involved in this because a very good friend of mine is Nancy Hopkins at MIT. And if you look on the right, there's this documentary that was made, Picture a Scientist, in which Nancy featured fairly heavily. And it was documenting the abuse that women suffer in science. And I've got to say, very often, we males abuse women in science without meaning to or without realizing that we do, because we're not aware. We sort of sometimes think if we treat women as though they were men, that's perfectly okay. It's not. Women are not men. They have different problems, and we have to recognize that. Now, the book, The Exceptions, I would recommend everybody in this room to read. It's a wonderful book. It's a document of what happened to Nancy Hopkins when she was first hired at MIT and how she eventually became a professor there and got the female scientists on the MIT faculty to go to the president and get the rules changed so that they were treated equally. It's a wonderful book. It's amazing. The book to the left of that, by Kati Kariko, she won the Nobel Prize last year for messenger RNA vaccines. This is her personal biography, and it's an amazing story. It's a terrible story. If you're a man and you think, well, maybe, you know, I've done some of this to a female colleague, you feel really bad about it. And the one on the left is actually a few years old. It's called Invisible Women. And it's not dealing specifically with science, but it's dealing with the way in which throughout society, women get discriminated against and get treated badly. And it's full of data, absolutely full of data. I would recommend that also. And I think we all, especially we men, should read these books, and it will give you some new insight into the things that we do that we don't mean to. We're not trying to cause trouble, but we do it inadvertently very often. So I think this is very good that ICGEB has these initiatives to help women to make sure that they do better. But I would definitely recommend reading these books. Okay, so thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
So do we have questions? This was really both inspiring, informative, and first Angola, please.